September 19th, 1944. The morning fog of Lorraine swallowed everything beyond 30 meters. The fields were silent, heavy, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Inside a Panther inching forward near Bison-la-Petite, Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann leaned into his periscope. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from what he had just witnessed in the gray void. A dark silhouette had flickered across the mist. Small, low, moving far faster than anything Hoffmann had ever seen on any battlefield. Two flashes burst from it. A heartbeat later, the machine vanished into the fog. By the time Hoffmann had rotated the turret halfway, a Panther 50 meters to his left was already burning. Nothing in armored warfare worked like this. Nothing accelerated like that. Nothing appeared and disappeared before a trained gunner could even react. Yet it had happened, and within minutes the entire 113th Panzer Brigade would learn that this was not an illusion, nor an isolated encounter. They had marched into a battle where every assumption carried from the Eastern Front, every lesson from Ukraine, every memory of Kursk was about to collapse. They had entered a fight where armor no longer ruled the battlefield, where speed reshaped every rule they believed in. They did not know its name. They had never imagined such a machine existed, but the men who survived the fog of Arracourt would remember it with a single word: Hellcat. The morning fog over Lorraine had always been thick, but September 19th, 1944 was different. The air felt heavy, damp, and strangely oppressive, as if the entire landscape had been wrapped inside a gray cocoon. The ground was cold enough to cling to every exhaust fume and swallow every silhouette. Even seasoned tank crews, men who had survived the furnace of Ukraine and the steel storms of Kursk, felt something unfamiliar as they moved forward in the mist. Not fear, not yet, but an unease they could not define. Ahead of them, the 113th Panzer Brigade, a unit newly assembled from hurried replacements and veteran fragments, advanced through the narrow corridors of visibility, straining to maintain formation. The Panthers crawled along the wet soil, engines muffled by the fog, periscopes nearly blind. The Germans believed they understood armored warfare. They believed that the rules forged in fire on the Eastern Front would carry them through any encounter with American armor. They believed they would fight the same battle again and again until victory came through skill, steel, and doctrine. They had no idea that the battlefield they were entering would tear those beliefs apart. This was Arracourt, and Arracourt was not a place for the old rules. Lorraine, in late September, is a deceptive land. At first glance, wide open and seemingly ideal for tank warfare. But beneath its quiet fields, the region hides ridgelines, shallow draws, broken hedges, and low earth berms. Features subtle enough to vanish under fog, yet perfect for concealing fast-moving vehicles. Visibility on that morning was barely 30 meters. Panthers, designed to dominate at long range, suddenly lost the very element they depended on. Their high-velocity guns, capable of shattering a Sherman at 1,500 meters, were reduced to blind metal tubes. Their commanders scanned a world made of shifting gray walls. Their drivers eased forward at walking speed. Their gunners saw only fog where targets should have been. Lorraine punished wait. It punished slow reaction. It punished armies that required visibility before acting. And in that environment, the United States had already taken position. Before dawn, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had slipped into concealed firing points, using the landscape like a cloak. Their vehicles sat silent, engines idling low, crews alert, eyes focused on invisible sectors of fire. The Germans had stumbled into an ambush layered not just across terrain, but across doctrine. Panther crews thought they had entered another conventional armored engagement, but Lorraine was the perfect terrain for a predator built on speed. The German counteroffensive in Lorraine was born out of desperation disguised as confidence. After the catastrophic retreat from Normandy and the collapse of defensive lines across France, the German High Command hoped that newly created armored brigades could regain initiative. Among these units was the 113th Panzer Brigade, formed in early September and sent to the front with remarkable speed. But Panzer Brigade was a name more impressive than the unit itself. The 113 suffered from insufficient training time, crews unfamiliar with their newly issued Panthers, a lack of mechanized infantry support, almost no reconnaissance capabilities, radio shortages, little coordination with artillery or adjacent units. Yet the Panthers they fielded were formidable machines, on paper. To the High Command, the Panther represented technological salvation, thick armor, a lethal 75mm L-70, and a reputation built on the Eastern Front. German officers believed that American forces still relied primarily on Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers, vehicles that, while numerous, operated at conventional speeds and relied on predictable maneuver patterns. Against those, the Panther remained dominant. What the Germans did not know, and could not know, was that the Americans had brought something different, something built not from evolutionary thinking, but from a reimagining of what armored combat could be. They were about to fight an enemy they had never been trained to fight. The origins of the weapon that would define Arracourt began far away, in Fort Meade, Maryland. It came from the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, the architect of the U.S. tank destroyer doctrine. Bruce was not driven by admiration of traditional armor battles. He studied the blitzkrieg with the analytical mind of a systems engineer. His conclusion was simple, but revolutionary. Do not fight German tanks the way Germans expect. Do not meet armor with armor. Strike faster than they can react. Disappear before they can respond. From this idea came a doctrine built around priorities that German designers would have considered madness: speed, firepower, crew efficiency, armor protection. Last and least important, American industry embraced this philosophy. General Motors assigned the design to Harley Earl, a legend of automotive aesthetics and engineering. His team produced a machine that looked less like a tank and more like a stripped-down racer with a 76mm cannon bolted on top. The result was the M18 Hellcat, just 20 tons, powered by the Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, able to reach 55 to 60 miles per hour on roads. More importantly, maintaining 35 to 40 miles per hour across broken ground, with a turret light enough to rotate rapidly and an automatic transmission that made hard maneuvering effortless. If the Panther was a heavyweight boxer, the Hellcat was a knife fighter who moved faster than the opponent's eyes could track. This was not evolution, it was revolution. At dawn on September 19th, the Germans began advancing with the conviction that American resistance would be light. Their intelligence suggested scattered Sherman forces and no substantial anti-tank defenses. They expected to push aside a screening line, then drive deep into the rear of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. Their confidence ignored several realities. The 704th TD Battalion had replaced M10s with brand new Hellcats. They had months of training in rapid flanking tactics. They used the terrain of Lorraine as a network of concealed lanes. Every Hellcat crew had a functional FM radio. American forces operated under flexible combined arms doctrine. Panthers were entering the battle blind without proper reconnaissance. The fog amplified every American advantage. It smothered the Panther's strengths, range, accuracy, heavy armor, and rewarded the Hellcat's agility. At 7:15, as the Germans crept forward, the first Hellcat engines roared to life. What followed was not a duel. It was a demonstration of doctrinal superiority. Around 8:45, as the morning haze thinned, the battlefield revealed its true nature. A Panther commander, one of the first to emerge from the fog line, reported, "A vehicle, small, impossibly fast, moved across our flank." Seconds later, 3 more Panthers were hit in rapid succession, struck not from the front, but from exposed side armor. This moment mattered more than the losses themselves. It shattered the unspoken certainty that had sustained German tank crews since 1943. We will dictate the engagement. We will see them first. We will fire first. We will kill them first. But at Arracourt, the opposite happened. The Germans did not see the enemy first. They did not fire first. They did not set the terms of the fight. They were reacting, always reacting, and losing. American crews had refined a system. One Hellcat would reveal itself on purpose. 2 others would sprint along unseen approaches. They would converge on the Panther's side armor, fire and relocate before the turret could traverse. This pattern, bait and double envelopment, was executed repeatedly. And it worked because the Panther's 7-ton turret could never rotate fast enough to counter it. While the Germans relied on visual line of sight and slow turret handling, Hellcats relied on instant radio communication, high-velocity mobility, rapid target handoff, cooperative angles of attack, coordinated timing. The Germans fought as individual tanks. The Americans fought as a network. As the fog lifted, the broader American system came into play. The 4th Armored Division was not simply defending, it was shaping the battle space. Sherman tanks moved as decoys. Armored infantry secured choke points. Field artillery fired pre-registered defensive barrages. Reconnaissance aircraft hovered above the battlefield, spotting movement through breaks in the mist. The Germans had entered a battlefield where every American element supported every other element. Panthers were strong machines, but they were isolated machines. They received little information. They had minimal coordination. They reacted slowly. They maneuvered cautiously. When a Panther fired, the muzzle flash revealed its location. Within seconds, artillery struck the area, and shortly afterward, a Hellcat team maneuvered into flanking position. It was not just a battle, it was a system dismantling a machine. By the late morning of September 19th, Panther crews realized something that no manual, no training, and no commander had ever prepared them for. Their strengths did not matter. Their rules did not apply. Their expectations were useless. A system designed for long-range engagements was being destroyed at close range. A tank designed for deliberate, methodical movement was being outmatched by speed and unpredictability. A doctrine built on offensive maneuver was being forced into defensive improvisation. The Germans expected another Sherman fight. They received something entirely different. And as the fog thinned and more Hellcats appeared along both flanks, a line was crossed, not only in the battle itself, but in the psyche of the Panzerwaffe. The old war had ended. A new war had begun. By noon, the Germans had not yet lost the battle, but they had lost the battle they wanted. Their formation was shattered by terrain. Their assumptions were shattered by speed. Their coordination was shattered by American radios. Their doctrine was shattered by innovation. The Americans had not simply prepared an ambush. They had prepared a new kind of battlefield, one in which German strengths dissolved and American strengths multiplied. When the last threads of fog burned off, a terrible clarity settled across Lorraine. The 113th Panzer Brigade had entered a battlefield designed to defeat them. The Hellcat was not a light tank destroyer. It was the embodiment of a new idea. The best armor is to never be hit. The best tactic is to move faster than the enemy can think. Arracourt was the proving ground, and the fog-shrouded morning was only the beginning. The first minutes of battle at Arracourt were violent and confusing, but they were only the prelude. The true shift, the moment where the Germans lost the initiative and the Americans seized control, began when the fog lifted enough for shapes to emerge, and the battlefield revealed itself as something far more complex than either side expected. This was the phase soldiers would later call the moment the rules broke. The moment when armored warfare changed from the familiar rhythm of range, firepower, and armor into a chaotic struggle where speed, timing, and communication dictated survival. It was here that the Germans realized they had stepped into a battlefield designed against them, and here that the Hellcats, small and deceptively fragile, became the dominant force. In armored warfare, landing is not always a beachhead. Sometimes it is the moment a force sets foot in a battlefield it fundamentally misreads. For the 113th Panzer Brigade, their landing happened the moment they moved into the fog-covered approaches around Arracourt, Moncourt, and Arracourt. They believed the terrain favored them. They believed their Panthers would dictate the engagement. They believed the Americans would respond slowly, clumsily, and predictably. They believed wrong. The 113th moved forward in columns that made sense on the Eastern Front, but were disastrously vulnerable in Lorraine's fog. No forward reconnaissance, no infantry screens, no wide flanking protection, vehicles spaced too far apart to support each other, commanders unable to maintain visibility, radio networks fragmented and inconsistent, Panthers advanced cautiously, turret traversing in narrow arcs, trying to identify silhouettes through a mist that muted sound and blurred distance. But the fog turned the German formation into a thin, stretched line, with each tank moving more like an isolated raider than part of a cohesive brigade. Meanwhile, the Americans had already prepared an intricate ambush. The Germans had landed on a battlefield already shaped, sculpted, and prepared by the defenders, without knowing it. German doctrine assumed a familiar pattern. Panthers would see first. Panthers would fire first. Panthers would destroy any American armor that challenged them. But reality was inverted. The fog neutralized visibility. Hellcats were already positioned. Sherman decoys distorted German perception. Artillery pre-registration gave Americans rapid strike capability. Radios gave Hellcats instantaneous coordination. The Germans entered the battlefield believing they were the hunters. In truth, they had become the hunted. The first appearance of an M18 Hellcat in the fog was not a duel. It was a shock. At 7:20, a Hellcat burst from concealment with a roar that Panther crews did not recognize. The machine leapt forward like an animal breaking from a trap, accelerating in a way no tracked vehicle should have been able to. To German eyes, it looked impossible. A Panther commander described it later. It did not appear, it arrived. The Hellcat sprinted across the German flank, fired into the exposed side armor of a Panther, and disappeared into the fog, all before the German turret turned halfway. This was the first sign that Arracourt would not be fought like any previous tank battle. The Germans were no longer in control of time. The Americans were dictating tempo. And tempo, more than armor or firepower, would decide the engagement. The Americans at Arracourt were not simply using fast vehicles. They were using a system. Each Hellcat platoon executed a coordinated pattern. A decoy. Hellcat revealed itself first, drawing the attention of the Panther's massive gun. Two Hellcats sprinted along concealed approaches on either flank. They aimed simultaneously at the Panther's side armor, the thinnest part of the German vehicle. They disappeared immediately after firing, before the German turret could traverse. This triad, bait, flank, kill, worked because the Panther's 7-ton turret was never designed to follow targets that moved at race car speed. The Germans were fighting the wrong type of enemy with the wrong type of machine. Turret-heavy power meant little in a battle defined by lateral speed. By 9 a.m., the fog loosened just enough for German crews to see beyond their immediate surroundings. What they saw was devastating. Hellcats were maneuvering on both flanks. Sherman tanks were positioned deliberately as decoys. American infantry held key terrain. Artillery observers had clear lines of sight. Radio chatter guided Hellcat teams in real time. A Panther platoon leader radioed in a frantic message, "Find überall, schnell, zu schnell." Enemy everywhere, fast, too fast. This was not the battlefield Germany had prepared for. This was a battlefield engineered to defeat German armor. The lifting fog exposed not only terrain, but the collapse of confidence. For the first time since 1941, German tankers realized they were reacting to an enemy who could predict their moves, outmaneuver their formations, and exploit their weaknesses faster than they could compensate. Among the American units positioned that morning, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper and his platoon became a symbol of what the Hellcat could achieve. Leiper positioned one Hellcat in an exposed but deliberate bait position, two Hellcats concealed in the fog, ready to flank, a final supporting element monitoring the German advance. When Leiper saw the muzzle of a Panther emerge through the mist, barely 30 feet away, he reacted instantly. The Hellcat engines roared. The vehicle sprang forward. Flanking paths diverged. Commands snapped over FM radios. Within 5 minutes, Leiper's platoon destroyed 5 Panther tanks, losing only one Hellcat in return. This exchange ratio was almost unthinkable for German tank doctrine, but it was entirely logical under American doctrine, where mobility and coordination eclipsed armor. This moment became the first major turning point of the battle. The Germans were no longer fighting the Americans they expected. They were fighting a doctrine they had never considered. Speed alone does not win battles, but speed that the enemy cannot counter? That breaks morale. By mid-morning, countless German reports expressed variations of the same thought. Sie sind zu schnell. Wir können nicht folgen. They are too fast. We cannot follow. This was not hyperbole. Panther crews literally could not track the Hellcats. 60 seconds for a full rotation. Slower when engine RPM was low. Heavy recoil disrupted aim at close range. Manual fine-tuning required precious seconds. Target tracking nearly impossible against fast-moving Hellcats. Hellcats exploited these gaps relentlessly, appearing only briefly, firing with precision, repositioning instantly, never staying where the Panther gunner expected. Every second the Hellcat moved was another second the Panther fell further behind. Veterans of Kursk had survived duels against hundreds of T-34s. They had outgunned and outmaneuvered tanks with inferior optics and weaker guns. But none of that mattered here. They were being defeated not by armor or firepower or numbers, but by tempo. That realization struck deep. As Hellcats shredded German flanks, other American elements tightened control of the battlefield. Shermans did not have to win. They only had to be seen. A Panther that engaged a Sherman was a Panther that revealed itself, exposed its side armor, or stopped moving long enough to be flanked by Hellcats. The Americans used Shermans as forward bait, attention anchors, misdirection tools. A Panther pointing at a Sherman was a Panther about to be destroyed. Artillery observers, freed by the clearing fog, directed precise barrages into likely Panther retreat paths. Every time a German tanker ordered a withdrawal, the ground erupted. Every time a Panther tried to reverse to cover, shells bracketed the position. Every hesitation became fatal. Hellcats carried the SCR 508 FM radio. Panthers relied on limited sets. Often only the platoon commander had a radio, with the rest dependent on flags or visual cues. This imbalance in information flow meant Americans maneuvered as one synchronized organism. Germans maneuvered as isolated individuals. The outcome was inevitable. By late morning, the Germans attempted several improvised solutions. Some crews attempted a desperate technique. Two Panthers parked with their rear armor touching, turrets facing opposite directions. The idea was to eliminate flanking vulnerabilities. In reality, they surrendered mobility. Artillery targeted them easily. Hellcats simply shifted angles. Communication between the two tanks was non-existent. The solution turned Panthers into stationary bunkers, the worst fate for a vehicle designed for movement. Other German units attempted to push aggressively through thick patches of remaining fog, but without reconnaissance, they became easy prey for American ambushes. Tanks separated from the brigade. Formations collapsed. Isolated Panthers died alone. There was no tactical solution the Germans could apply. The battlefield's physics had turned against them. By 12 o'clock, the Germans had lost more than vehicles. They had lost the battle's tempo. And in armored warfare, tempo is everything. They could no longer dictate engagement range, control the angles of attack, coordinate multi-tank pushes, retreat in formation, protect their flanks, maintain offensive momentum. Meanwhile, the Americans dictated every phase. Hellcats struck where they wanted. Shermans fixed German attention. Artillery sealed escape routes. Infantry secured crossroads. Reconnaissance spotted movement. Radio networks maintained cohesion. Germany had entered the engagement expecting a duel. Instead, they were overwhelmed by a combined arms machine. The tactical plan the Germans believed in, the long-range duel, the superiority of armor, the disciplined advance, had evaporated. In its place stood a type of battle where speed replaced armor, maneuver replaced firepower, initiative replaced machine weight, information replaced gun caliber. The Germans were not just losing tanks, they were losing the mental model of how tank warfare worked. They were fighting a future they did not yet understand, and losing. The fires on the Lorraine plains had only begun to burn. What followed the first clashes of September 19th was not a continuation of the earlier engagement, but a collapse of the entire tactical environment into something twisted, chaotic, and violent. The battlefield no longer resembled an armored duel. It had become a maze of fog, smoke, shattered formations, and frantic maneuvers. An environment where no one could see more than a moment into the future, and where decisions made in 3 seconds determined whether men lived or died. German crews who survived the opening assault tried to reorganize, regroup, and reclaim some semblance of order. But Arracourt no longer offered order. It offered pressure, and that pressure crushed the very structure of the Panzer brigades from the inside. Inside this growing chaos, the battle descended into something else, something closer to a nightmare than a military engagement. This was the true hell of Arracourt, the hell within. By early afternoon on September 19th, the battle had devolved into a web of micro-engagements. The fog, the scattered fields, and the low ridge lines created a labyrinth where Panthers, Shermans, and Hellcats collided at shockingly close distances. Panther crews described silhouettes appearing 10 meters away, engines roaring from multiple directions, shells streaking through smoke without visible origin, targets shifting before turrets could turn. The inability to distinguish friend from foe until impacts landed. German doctrine did not allow for this. Their tanks were designed to fight at distances of hundreds of meters, ideally over a kilometer, not at ranges where commanders had to shout warnings to adjacent vehicles. The battlefield echoed with the mechanical scream of Hellcat engines at full throttle, the grinding clatter of Panther transmissions struggling to shift, the crack of 76mm rounds finding side armor, the heavier, thunderous blast of the Panther's 75mm gun, the hiss of ricochets, the panic in German radio channels as formations dissolved. The fog magnified every sound, hid every threat, and swallowed every attempt to rebuild cohesion. What the Germans encountered was not an American vehicle, but an American rhythm. By mid-afternoon, a consistent pattern emerged, one that Panther crews recognized but could do nothing to stop. The Hellcat killed differently than any tank the Germans had fought. A Panther would hear nothing, then engines screaming, then 2 or 3 flashes, then silence again. No lingering duel, no trading of shots, no time to calculate distance, just a kill and disappearance. German veterans later said, "We shot at ghosts." But they were not ghosts. They were crews who had mastered the art of attacking at angles the Germans had never trained against. Hellcat crews moved in fluid, knife-like arcs, accelerate toward the flank, fire once or twice, reposition before the turret could follow, call out new targets by radio, repeat the cycle. It was relentless in its shattered German nerves. A Panther gunner wrote after the war, "They were not trying to defeat us, they were trying to unmake us." And in many ways, that is exactly what happened. As the battle intensified, the real destruction of the 113th Panzer Brigade occurred not through American firepower, but through structural breakdown. German radio discipline crumbled under pressure, overlapping transmissions, commanders shouting for support, gunners begging for bearings, operators reporting invisible threats, tank leaders calling for infantry that didn't exist, platoons losing track of each other, disconnected tanks wandering blind. Meanwhile, American FM radio nets remained clear, coordinated, constant, precise. When one Hellcat spotted a Panther, every Hellcat knew where it was within seconds. German isolation became fatal. Inside the chaos, the Panther's design, so deadly in long-range duels, transformed into a liability. Slow turret traverse made close-range fights nearly impossible. Large silhouette made it easy to spot. Weak side armor turned every flanking hit into a kill. Mechanical fragility punished rapid maneuvers. Limited visibility made fog and smoke deadly. A Panther needed time, space, and clear sight lines. Arracourt gave it none. The Hellcat needed speed, angles, and communications. Arracourt gave it everything. By late afternoon, one man's actions became legendary. Sergeant Henry R. Hartman, commanding an M18 Hellcat, used the terrain, fog, and speed to devastating effect. In a span of a few hours, Hartman's Hellcat knocked out 6 Panthers. He used a simple, deadly pattern: approach at max speed using terrain folds, appear at an unexpected angle, fire at the gap between the Panther's mantelet and glacis, immediately reverse into defilade, reappear from an entirely new direction. This pattern was the nightmare the Germans could not solve. A German tanker recalled, "He came from everywhere. We fired at smoke, we fired at sound, we fired at ghosts." Hartman was not a ghost. He was the living embodiment of the doctrine the Germans had dismissed as naive. Toward late afternoon, the fog thickened again. Visibility collapsed once more. But this time, only one side could fight inside the mist. The Germans had no reconnaissance, no forward observers, no infantry screens, no reliable radio network. The Americans had FM radios, aerial observers, artillery spotting, pre-planned defensive grids. Panthers wandered into kill zones without knowing. Hellcats struck from angles Panthers did not expect. Shermans drew fire and marked the Panthers' positions like beacons. Every German attempt to regroup collapsed into another American interception. By evening, dozens of Panthers were no longer in fighting condition, not because of American firepower, but because of mechanical failures. Panther transmissions, overstressed by rapid acceleration, constant turning, sudden stops, shifting weight on soft soil, began failing at an alarming rate. Hellcats, using robust airplane engines and automotive transmissions, simply kept going. Panther final drives, already notorious, began collapsing under stress. Many Panthers were abandoned intact because they could not reverse, they could not turn, they could not climb a gentle slope, they could not change gears. When Panthers stopped moving, Hellcats finished them. The battlefield became littered with burning wrecks, crippled hulls, abandoned vehicles, Panthers with killed engines, Panthers sinking into soft ground, Panthers stranded after failed maneuvers. It was a graveyard built not only by American fire, but by German engineering choices colliding with American doctrine. As chaos spread, the Americans achieved something the Germans never expected: geometric dominance. The battlefield became a three-dimensional chessboard. Hellcats controlled the flanks. Shermans controlled the center lanes. Artillery controlled depth. Infantry controlled the choke points. Recon controlled visibility. Radios connected every piece. Panthers were reduced to isolated pockets, small groups stumbling in fog, pairs with no mutual support, single tanks trapped by terrain. The German formation had disintegrated. The American system had solidified. By late afternoon, the German collapse was no longer just tactical, it was psychological. German crews realized they could not dictate range, they could not dictate angle, they could not track targets, they could not form defensive lines, they could not advance, they could not retreat safely, they could not rely on their own machines. A Panther officer captured days later said, "We were not fighting tanks. We were fighting speed." He meant it literally, he meant it metaphorically. As September 19th closed, the Germans attempted to salvage what they could: reorganize battered platoons, pull survivors back toward assembly points, radio for reinforcements, prepare for renewed fighting. But the fighting had already changed. The psychological advantage, once firmly held by the Germans, now belonged entirely to the Americans. Hellcat crews slept knowing they could outrun, outmaneuver, and outfight their enemy. Panther crews slept, if they slept at all, knowing the daylight would bring more speed, more surprise, and more losses. The term "the hell within" became a nickname used by survivors on both sides. To Americans, it described the intensity of close-range combat. To Germans, it described the feeling of being trapped in a battlefield where nothing worked the way it should. The hell was inside the fog, inside the burning hulls, inside the failing transmissions, inside the confusion, inside the doctrine that could not adapt, inside the minds of commanders who saw the battle slipping away. This was hell not because of destruction, but because of inversion. Everything the Germans believed about armored warfare flipped upside down. Heavy armor meant nothing. High-velocity guns meant nothing. Strong frontal plates meant nothing. Long-range optics meant nothing. The only things that mattered were speed, angles, radios, initiative, adaptability. In this environment, the Panther was outdated the moment the battle began. The final days of the Battle of Arracourt did not unfold with the sweeping momentum of a breakthrough or the dramatic collapse of a front line. Instead, they came as a slow tightening of a noose, a systematic dismantling of German armored strength, confidence, and doctrine. The battlefield, once filled with movement and expectation, narrowed into a deadly arena where every German decision carried immediate consequences and every American movement felt coordinated, deliberate, and precise. For the Germans, these were the days when hope gave way to frustration, and frustration gave way to inevitability. For the Americans, it was the moment where a revolutionary idea, speed over armor, coordination over mass, proved itself not in theory, but in fire. These were the final days, and they revealed the nature of a war that was already changing. The morning of September 20th began with German officers attempting to rebuild coherence inside their shattered brigades. The 113th Panzer Brigade had taken heavy losses the previous day, and many of the surviving Panthers were scattered across the terrain in small, disorganized groups. But disorganization was not their only problem. As the sun rose, the fog lifted earlier than the day before. German tankers assumed this would be to their advantage. Clear sight lines meant long-range engagements, exactly what the Panther had been designed for. But clearer skies revealed not opportunity, but exposure. From concealed positions, American Hellcats already held high ground. Sherman units occupied key road intersections. Artillery observers had full visibility. Reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead. Armored infantry blocked lateral movement. The Germans attempting to advance found themselves under fire before their own gunners could identify who was shooting. What they thought would be a return to traditional tank warfare became instead the moment they realized the Americans had prepared the battlefield on every level. The Germans still possessed dozens of operational Panthers, but confidence had evaporated. Even when they spotted American tanks, they hesitated, uncertain if Hellcats lurked on the flanks or if a Sherman in front of them was simply drawing fire. A German commander later wrote, "Every shot was a trap, every field was an approach, every shadow was a threat." The battlefield felt unnatural to them, tilted toward an opponent they could not predict. And beneath that uncertainty, the Americans closed in. September 21st saw the American forces shift from opportunistic engagements to deliberate, aggressive action. The previous day's chaos had given way to clarity. The Americans understood the terrain, the rhythm of German maneuvers, and the weak points in their formation. On the morning of September 22nd, one of the most stunning moments in the battle occurred. Hellcats, for the first time in the engagement, used their full speed in open daylight. Engineers had marked a path across a long, open field. When German tanks appeared on the far ridge, American commanders gave the order. Hellcats accelerated. The ground trembled. Dust and smoke erupted behind them. To German crews watching from the ridge, the sight was incomprehensible. Panthers tried to track the charging vehicles, but the Hellcats closed the distance too fast. German sights lagged behind. Shells flew wide. Turrets rotated in vain. By the time the Panthers adjusted aim, Hellcats were already among them, firing into side armor, darting between burning wrecks, and breaking apart the formation. A German officer simply wrote, "It was a storm made of metal and speed." Panther crews used to fighting lumbering opponents felt overwhelmed not by numbers, but by pace. The Hellcats were not faster by a small margin. They were faster by a degree that made conventional tactics irrelevant. German crews felt hunted in daylight. They felt ambushed in open terrain. They felt surrounded even when no Americans were visible. The psychological damage was immense. Up to this point, American actions had been dominated by local initiative. Hellcat platoons exploiting fog, terrain, and speed. But on September 23rd, the battle shifted again. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, entered the fight with a plan that integrated every American asset into a single, synchronized machine. Abrams understood a truth the Germans had forgotten. Tanks do not win battles alone. Systems do. He arranged the battlefield into 3 coordinated layers. Shermans drew German fire at mid-range. Hellcats flanked at high speed. Artillery cut off escape routes. Infantry held choke points. Reconnaissance aircraft guided maneuver. Engineers controlled movement through terrain. Panther crews suddenly found themselves attacked from the front, struck from the side, pinned from above, and blocked from behind, all at once. Panther units tried to form defensive lines, but artillery forced them to disperse. Hellcats punished any attempt to stay stationary. Shermans threatened from the front. Infantry ambushed from forest edges. Every movement resulted in exposure. Every attempt to hide resulted in isolation. Every attempt to concentrate resulted in being encircled. A German after-action report summarized their helplessness. "We could not move without dying. We could not stay without dying." This was the essence of the American system. Not the firepower of any one vehicle, but the coordination of many. By September 25th, the German offensive was effectively finished, though many Panthers still existed on paper. In reality, the brigade was broken beyond repair. Even experienced officers like Hasso von Manteuffel, renowned for tactical brilliance, understood the situation. He issued one of the most shocking orders ever given to German armored units. "Do not pursue. Do not engage in mobile battle. Hold position only." This order betrayed a grim truth. Germany's elite tanks, the instruments of blitzkrieg, were being forbidden from maneuvering. The Panther had become a bunker. American units swept through the battlefield, eliminating remaining Panthers in small ambushes, rapid encirclements, coordinated assaults, close-range flanking fires. Hellcats moved like a pack, no longer hunting lone tanks, but collapsing entire pockets of resistance. Shermans engaged German armor only when advantageous, otherwise functioning as bait, distraction, or blocking force. Panthers lacking infantry, reconnaissance, or artillery support could do nothing to stop the collapse. By evening, the results were unmistakable. 39 German tanks destroyed. 4 Hellcats destroyed, 3 damaged. German brigades combat ineffective. American forces intact and confident. The battle was over. but its lessons were just beginning. Arracourt was not a large battle by the standards of the Eastern Front or the Western campaigns, but it was one of the most important tactical engagements of the war because it reshaped the understanding of armored combat. German tank development followed a straight line: thicker armor, stronger guns, heavier chassis, longer range duels. This worked when their opponents played the same game, but when faced with speed, communication, flexibility, integrated doctrine, mass production, mobility-based tactics, the evolutionary path failed. The Panther was the pinnacle of an old idea, and the old idea no longer ruled the battlefield. The M18 Hellcat embodied a principle that would define future battlefields. The best armor is not being hit. Speed became a form of protection. Mobility became a form of firepower. Information became the decisive weapon. Arracourt proved that tanks do not need heavy armor to dominate. Coordination beats armor thickness. Speed beats firepower when used correctly. Radios beat brute strength. Doctrine beats engineering. The Panther was a masterpiece of metallurgy. The Hellcat was a masterpiece of philosophy. For the first time since 1940, German tank crews felt hunted. They were no longer the apex predators of mechanized warfare. One Panther officer wrote after the war, "Arracourt was when we understood the war had moved on without us." The Hellcat was not the only cause, but it was the catalyst. Modern tanks, from the M1 Abrams to the Leopard 2, carry the lessons of Arracourt. Speed matters. Situational awareness matters. Integrated operations matter. Reliability matters. Production scalability matters. The heavy steel doctrines of the early war had been surpassed by ideas forged in the fog of Lorraine. When veterans of both sides returned to Arracourt decades later, they walked the same ridges, the same fields, the same valleys where speed had proven stronger than armor. They stood in a landscape that looked peaceful, but had once been the stage for a quiet revolution. Germans looked at the restored Hellcat that raced across the field during the commemoration and saw the shape of the enemy that overturned their doctrine. Americans looked at the Panther wreck still rusting in farm hedgerows and saw the monument to a philosophy that speed had rendered obsolete. Arracourt was not merely a tactical victory. It was not merely a duel of machines. It was the moment when heavy armor met mobility. Tradition met innovation. Certainty met speed. And speed won. A German veteran summarized it best. "We were not defeated by the Hellcat. We were defeated by the future." Arracourt was that future. Born in fog, proven in fire, and remembered as the battlefield where the old world of armored warfare came to its end.